agenda is area-wide mitigation. So I think that's you as well, Mr. Taylor. And if the others would like to join us, I think you have a presentation that you'd like to make to us.
Yep. And as per Monday, Madam Chair, I'll be told to take a back seat while Mr. McFarlane takes us through his presentation.
The experts, he's right beside me. That felt like a pantomime for a minute. I was going to say, look behind you.
You have the hot seat there, Mr. McFarlane. I'll join the cheap seats.
I don't really need it. I can stand it.
You come up because you're more valuable than me at this point.
Well, there's two chairs there, so you can stay.
You're going to fit in together. And you'll be able to do the talking even better.
Oh, yeah, right. Thank you.
So can I just, before Don starts off, I am going to... So one of the things that we said that we would do was, if you recall the last conversation that Council had, there was, I think that one of the fundamental points I think you made, Leanne, was the concept that actually when did potentially area-wide mitigation make the most sense? And I think we discussed as a council that in fact really it was prior to the decision to actually use the red zone offer as the primary tool for managing the at-risk properties on the Port Hills. And since that time, people have obviously engaged with the government and have sold down. So the number of properties that potentially could make use of this has continued to diminish. So what we had committed to do at the last meeting was actually go back through some of the work and take you through the work that was done in 2012 prior to the Minister making his decision to go through the red zone offer, which was an evaluation of the potential for area-wide mitigation. So that's really why we're here today. It's what we're coming back to talk to you about. And I'll pass over to Don and Ian and Irfan on the end there to take you through that work.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll just start even a step further back, and that was that I guess in mid to late 2011, Sarah commissioned GeoVert to have a look at the possibilities of area-wide mitigation. And they came up with a whole series of rockfall fences, basically fenced the city off from the hills, and 23 kilometres of fences, I believe, in total for that. That made Sarah a little nervous, and so they then started talking to the Port Hills Geotechnical Group about bringing their understanding and knowledge of what was out there into play as well. And we had 3 workshops where we talked about concepts and possibilities. And that's all we talked about. There was never any design work done. It was just talking about what appeared to be technically feasible, and later some preliminary costing work was done as well. But initially it was just what could we do that we believe would be technically feasible, and that didn't take into account a lot of the issues that came to light later, such as property ownership and insurance issues and a number of the other factors that the Minister used in making his decision. But what we did do, and we'll show you just a few examples, we looked at what we thought would be technically viable. So we'll start with the Avoca Valley, which is up on screen there. And what we came up with as a concept at that stage was a big, long earth embankment structure, a bund. So that's it's colour-coded in green to say that it was a bund. We didn't go into assessing how high it might be and those sorts of issues, but it was placed quite high on the slope because it meant that the property owners would still have access to most of their property. We couldn't go any higher because we were getting up into the rocks, and if we went way down behind the houses, that meant that the property owners with a big structure could not get to the back of their properties. So technically feasible, practically maybe not a very good idea. At that stage, of course, all those properties were hadn't been categorised as red zone. Since that time, the red zoning has gone on, and D124 notices the whole bit. When we did the area-wide mitigation review that you guys asked for, we made a point of looking for places where there were at least 2 adjacent properties that could still be protected, because otherwise the individual property options were already available. When we came to the Avoca Valley, there were only 2 properties side by side, And so one location where you could actually consider doing area-wide mitigation. Now, the advantage of just one or two properties is that you can then optimise the location of the barrier, and in this case you could bring a barrier of some sort down right behind the houses. And so that's basically as far as we went with our review, to say yes, there's still two properties that you could do it, would still be a barrier of some sort, and we believe it would be viable. In other areas, similar sort of story. You got Morgan's Valley handy? So again, ignore the colours, please, but the big green thing is the Port Hill Group's idea of a barrier just above the residential property. So everything up to the right of that is farmland and getting progressively steeper as you go up the slope. If we look at where rocks had actually fallen to, we've got that layer. You can see all the green dots. So a lot of the dots have stopped further upslope, but some have come further downslope than where that barrier was being proposed. So the idea was to protect all of the houses and all of the vacant sections up through the valley at that point in time. At the very head of the valley, which is the bottom of the screen, it was considered somewhat too difficult to protect some of those properties, and the ones that are not shaded red were deemed to be safe and not to need protection anyway. Now, when we came back and reviewed that in January this year, we were down to just two properties that were still there that were not owned by Sarah at the time. And since then, and these are the ones shaded in dark red that are owned by Sarah, since then those two properties have also accepted the offer. So, in fact, when we came to the Morgan's Valley, there wasn't very much left at all that could be considered. What else have you got? You choose. Heberton Avenue. Okay. This is quite an interesting area. This is Sumner Vale end of, so Heberton Avenue to the right, Wakefield Avenue over to the left. On the right, the blue zones are areas where we thought that rockfall protection work at source would be viable. So you'd go in and you do rock bolts, mesh, all sorts of things to stop the rocks from falling. Does not mean you would cover that whole area with metallic things. It just means that within that area there's a lot of rock that could potentially be stabilised. But you need to remember that those are extremely steep slopes and bluffs. Some of them are very unstable and very dangerous to have people working on. So that's part of the solution. Then the light grey line just above the dark red is a suggestion for putting in rockfall fences. So this is where it's too steep to put in a bund, but you could put in rockfall fences, and the fences are designed to absorb a lot of energy, so they deflect a lot when rocks hit them. They also are only designed to sustain a few hits from rocks, so if a whole bluff collapses, it'll just wipe it out. But the idea was we could protect, the houses all the way along through there. But when we came back to review it in January this year, we were down to just two places where there was still more than one property together that had not accepted the offer. On the other side of the valley, which take advantage of Finsabi Place. Now you've had Andrew Abercarn come in and talk about, he's the light pink one right in the middle of that blob of red, just in there. His house is just about where the big stripy things come across. In this case, the blue stripes are actually indicating where we were suggesting earthworks to bench the slope to form level surfaces, so you get a series of level surfaces. Rocks generally would tend to stop on the level surfaces. When they hit a level surface, they slow down very quickly. And then on the outside edge of that, you would put a barrier of some sort, perhaps a rock fence, so that anything that did get to the end would get stopped at that point. The disadvantage of that, of course, is that it takes out large amounts of the property that you're trying to protect. So we're limited by getting up onto the Captain Thomas track and reserve land above that, so we couldn't encroach on that, so you have to then encroach onto the property owner's own land to protect them. The current situation, of course, is that almost all of them have accepted the offer, and if we look at area-wide mitigation as requiring two or more properties side by side, there aren't any. So, and yeah, Bridle Path Road and Hamilton Lane area. The solution in 2012 seemed quite easy here, that you could put a barrier with a mixture of a earth bund and rock fence along, basically below the quarry and then along further behind upslope of houses, would have protected quite a lot of properties. But by now, of course, the ones in dark red have all accepted the Crown offer, so we've got quite a lot less available, still eligible properties. 2012 version is basically a slight modification, so it's a reduction in the scale of what was being proposed before. And the last site that we looked at,
What was it?
that's all of them, isn't it?
Yep, that's all.
Okay. So those are the 5 that we thought we'd show you just to talk about the sort of concepts for work as it was looked at in 2012 and what's actually left that would still meet our criteria to be protected.
One of the things that we asked for was information on supporting calculations which underpin the cost-benefit analysis, including expanding to cover Crown-owned property. That was based on the 2007 figures. Have you got that?
Refer to costs.
We've given you the figures previously on the areas that we've looked at. When we've come to look at Crown-owned land, I suppose there are 2 issues there. One is, as we explained the last time, it's determining what Crown-owned land you think you want to include, and I suppose what we also alluded to was the minute you start to grow the number of properties, the nature of the solution also changes. So as we've previously discussed, simply adding properties doesn't help. But the issue that we have is with Crown-owned land, we actually think that the outcome actually remains relatively unchanged, because we are actually effectively any bit of Crown-owned land we've already paid 50% of. So we're in a mathematical game of actually buying, potentially, in theory, buying the Crown out. So we've already paid for. If I step back, the concept of area-wide mitigation would say that the cost of doing the area-wide mitigation is, or the benefit of doing area-wide mitigation outweighs the cost that we would invest in that, being the 50% of the properties being protected. Where we've got Crown-owned land, we've effectively already made that investment because we're already a part owner in general of that land. So if we are to include that land, we would have to effectively have the Crown's agreement to buy that land off. We've already paid for it once. We would then be in a position where either that cost would have to be added to the cost of the area-wide mitigation, or we would have to get into a slightly circuitous solution of selling that land back to the owners and then being prepared to put 50% back in to the solution. So we don't have the dollars, we just get ourselves into...
No, I realise that. I think everyone understands that we're in a sort of catch-22 as far as that process goes. I think people wanted to know whether the economics of what the proposals would have been different had the, based on the earlier figures, because we thought that there had been earlier figures done. But I think what you're saying is that if we have, it would have been pretty rough and ready.
Yeah, do you want to talk about the earlier figures?
So the earlier figures the work that was done in 2012 was based on the technical feasibility assessments that Don has just shown you, with very, very preliminary calculations as to the financial viability of that, which we did, the council did, and then fed through to Sarah. So what they've just shown you on the screen as to what could have been done in 2012 reflects those calculations.
So it met the cost benefit test, but was that based on 50% or 100%?
100%.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so the 50% figure doesn't exist. And what you're saying to me is that you couldn't make that comparison because it isn't a question of just protecting the additional number of properties because with the same structure, because you'd have to actually do this degree of work.
That's right. Yes, and I think the Avoca Valley, I don't know if Irfan would go back to that one and show the two, because I think, again, and perhaps Don will explain that as you protect more, you're pushing back up the slope because of the bounce angle, so that the nature of the solution becomes bigger each time as well.
And I understood too that perhaps one of the comments that was made the other day was that given that you could actually end up building a massive structure in order to protect against every eventuality, which it could never do. Can you go back to the big picture that was there before, like the one with the long line?
Have put both of them up.
Yeah, that one. So,
Maybe I'll...
are you saying that you wouldn't suggest that long line anymore, even if you were protecting that number of properties, given what you know now?
What you have to, yeah, in the short answer, yes, you're right. We would not recommend that. That would not be the optimum solution.
Right.
If you go down to the level of the individual properties, the solution would be different almost for every property side by side. So where it might be best to put a rock fence in one or a bund in another or level an area behind another one, for a single house you can come up with a solution that will not necessarily work as soon as you've got 2 or 3 or 4 houses involved.
Maybe I can, I think you're alluding, well, was possibly something I was alluding to in the last time we spoke, is the mitigation of the hazard or the risk reduction. What the engineers are saying is that we can reduce the risk. In these structures, you'll never eliminate the risk unless you physically haul half the hill away, take the missiles away. The engineering structure will always have a sort of amount of risk, and the basic formula is if we did one of these structures, you'd reduce the GNS's annual individual fatality risk to a factor of 10. So if it was 10 to the minus 2, it would only be 10 to the minus 3, which is still unacceptable. So there is still that residual liability, which again, by its nature, rockfall, we can't say exactly what rocks do. We know the rough parameters. So there's always that risk, residual risk.
Yeah. Yanni?
So, what I've heard is we don't have the information on 1.23.
Sorry?
In terms of page 215. 1.23, we don't have information on the supporting calculations which underpin the cost-benefit analysis, including expanding to cover crown-owned properties.
So can you just refer me back to that, what page number?
215.
It's right at the beginning, purpose and origin of the report. So we have got the original, we've got what underpins the cost-benefit analysis, but not expanding it to cover crown-owned property, because that's not possible to calculate.
It's not possible.
Well, it's not possible to calculate unless we get them to do the work on what they would propose now, given what they've, the last, however long, when did they first put this together? 2012?
Yeah.
So unless we ask them to go back and review the work they did in 2012, we will never get the figures for what it would cost to cover Crown-owned property. You couldn't do the cost-benefit analysis on that.
Right. Because why not?
Well, that's what they just explained.
Well, I mean, ultimately, I suppose, yes, you could do it, but it's an exercise to go back to all of the land on the Port Hills that was red zone and work out and do a more detailed analysis of the solution. So we go back and relook at the solution.
This solution, we've just heard them say the solution wouldn't be what they proposed.
That's right, so we have to recast the solution.
But it's given what they know now as opposed to what they knew then. Yes?
Yep, so as Donna said, given our level of understanding, the solutions would probably be modified. So we would have to effectively go through an exercise of working out the solutions. Then we'd have to go back and work out an exercise of all of the land or part of the land or what have you.
So the paper that went to Cabinet that said it was cost effective to do area-wide mitigation, you're saying you've got a new way of doing it now that no longer applies and means that it's not cost beneficial.
No, that was based on the 100%, Yanni.
But isn't that the point? I mean...
No, it was based on the 100%. We've only ever been, when the decisions were ultimately made, it was only based on us contributing 50%.
Right.
So you've got a very different basis for the calculation the first time round.
And I guess that what the government was looking for right from the outset, as they did on the flatland, was what is a well, relatively rough and ready way of doing a cost-benefit analysis. That's why they chose the 2007 rating valuations.
Yeah. Okay. The second question I have is around vacant sections. So in terms of our district plan, in terms of the vacant section liability that we might face, so if someone, bought a section, currently has no offer, we're changing our district plan to prohibit development, effectively meaning that the land becomes worthless. What liability do we have in regards to compensation, if any, or I guess maybe there's a moral argument, but what's the current thinking behind what we do in terms of vacant section owners, if we're not going to provide area-wide mitigation to enable development?
So I suppose firstly we don't have any liability. So people would be, whatever their circumstances, be entitled to rely on existing use rights if they've got existing use rights, but if they haven't, then we're not liable for rights that have never been exercised, and those rights have changed. Also, there's very few instances in the, so the district plan, the way it's drafted now, allows for both discretionary and non-complying activity, so people could still, if they really chose to, test that. But what we have said as a council is that as the first principle, we don't want to be encouraging new development in those high-risk areas, which is why we've made it non-complying, and that if someone chooses to do that, they can seek to do that by way of a consent, but they would obviously have a fairly high test to pass to get that.
So, last time we discussed this, my understanding was we were still waiting for MB guidelines around rockfall protection structures. Have those been received? What do they say? Is it easier now for people to apply a common kind of standard to getting mitigation?
So the council has its own set of technical guidelines for rockfall protection structures. We've had them since December 2012. There's a project that Ian and Don have been involved in recently where MB is working with us to review those guidelines with a view to issuing them, I think, effectively as MB endorsed guidelines.
Yeah, and I think as for wider use.
Yeah.
So, and that becomes the complication, I think. To take it nationwide, they've got to think through a few other issues.
And the time frame that they are working to on that is it's a matter of months, but in the intervening period, there's nothing stopping an applicant coming up with a design against those guidelines and coming in and seeking a consent. People are doing that. Numbers of people are doing that right at the moment.
People can go to MB and get the S124 reviewed and possibly lifted based on some sort of criteria. It just seems odd that there wouldn't be MB guidelines around what levels of risk and structures.
I think ultimately, at the end of the day, while they're a guideline, they are that a guideline. So ultimately, the council will still be responsible for issuing the consents, and obviously, a little bit like our discussion before, we will rely on professional judgment by the geotech engineers and the building control officers to do that. So the guidelines will give some sense, and I think I think we've drawn some comfort from the fact that they've taken our guidelines as the basis for what they might do. We could all perhaps suggest or argue that it's remiss of the government or MB not to have had guidelines for this in the past, but I suppose we haven't had this sort of event in the past in recent history. So, but we are responsible as the Building Control Authority for issuing those consents, and the guidelines that we've developed, we're confident are robust in doing that.
Final question was, I understand we approached the Minister. He's said no to a number of things. Is there a letter that we've got back from him that we could attach or that we could make public?
I think there is a letter, yes. Yeah, I think it's fairly brief, but I think it's, yes, it's there.
I think it would be useful to see what the request was and have it recorded in the minutes.
I haven't got a copy, so.
I don't have a copy on me, but I recall there was a formal response from officials.
So, shall we just circulate that?
Yes, certainly. Yep.
All right. Can we do that? Can we attach it subsequently
Yes.
to the? Yeah. All right. So that'll be put on the website along with the report. All right. Well, I'll move the recommendation. Do we have a seconder? Phil Clearwater. Debate. Yep. Yanni.
So probably comes as no surprise, but I won't support the staff recommendation. I do think that as part of the cost share agreement that was signed with the government, there was a clear way in which we could have actually presented a case if it was cost effective to do area-wide mitigation, to enable people to stay in their own communities, in their own houses. And I just think that we've got a huge issue with people with vacant sections and people that are living in the red zone with S124s either being removed or in some cases people having them put on. So I think it's a real shame that we're basically wiping out communities through not enabling area-wide mitigation. And I know that the government actually has been the one that has pretty much made the call. They've basically said that, you know, they won't support mitigation. We're not allowed to use their land. I think they may have given us some rights to access it in certain occasions, but generally they've been pretty unsupportive of doing this. But I think we could actually present the case, do the work and show it's cost effective and present the case to them to get areas rezoned. So I can't support us not doing area-wide mitigation. I think it's been unfortunate that it's taken so long because obviously more people have been under pressure to settle the offer, and that has meant that there's less and less people available to do this on. But yeah, I can't support the staff recommendation. I do appreciate we've got the individual policy approach that we're trying to continue with, but that again has been quite hard for people as well to go through. It puts a huge burden on individuals, and it is quite a difficult and time-consuming process to go through. So that's my view on this. Thank you.
Well, for me, it's with heavy heart that I will be supporting it. I mean, we've got to send a message at some point that where levels of risk are too high, that we don't endorse people developing in those areas. We've had a history of allowing development where it should never ever have gone, and I think this is a situation. We've had a tragic, devastating earthquake, which has brought a lot of issues out in our city, and I think the way forward is that we've got to start making some hard calls, and that's why we're here. We're here to make hard calls. This is a hard call. I am pleased to note that we still support individual property protection, which I think is really important because there are some people, as we know, they're still living there in very dangerous circumstances, and I think it's with some urgency we look to actually help those people remediate their properties so they can live there safely, and we can actually rest easy at night that we know we're doing all we can in those areas. So I will be supporting, because I just don't want to send out a message to the community that we and raising hopes where we know with new information going forward that the likelihood of actually area-wide mitigation is not going to be that feasible or possible in our current financial position, and I think even in their own personal positions as well. So, as I say, heavy heart, I'll be supporting it.
Phil?
It's with reluctance I support it too. I think though we've covered all of the areas, and though, you know, for the properties that where it does, the mitigation does work for, that's been fully covered, and it, as Paul indicated, it's still open for individuals to apply to have their own property mitigated as well on an individual basis. And there's no question that what it's about is rockfall risk, and I think that there is a point in terms of people's safety where in fact the recommendations do stack up. And so it's because this affects individual people and individuals' lives, that's my reluctance, but equally this is for by far the greater good. So I'm supporting it.
Andrew?
Thank you. Yeah, what we've seen this afternoon is that at a certain time, this could have been a workable process in some situations. What we've also seen is that as time has passed, that opportunity has also passed, and I therefore find it difficult to support committing further resources to this work. And I also think we need to be very mindful of the need to provide certainty, and in some cases we know that it'll be unpalatable, but we need to provide certainty to people that are caught in these situations. The opportunity for individual mitigation does still exist, and by providing certainty around the area-wide mitigation possibilities, then we possibly drive some people into that opportunity instead. So, yeah, again, as with other speakers, it's with some reluctance that I support this afternoon, but for the reasons outlined, I will be supporting it.
Okay, so I just want to comment and put on record the actual paragraph of the cost share agreement that I think really does tie our hands. And I want to thank staff for actually going to the effort that they have done to try and find every solution that was possible, but again, restricted by what has been agreed. The parties agree that if a cost-effective engineering solution can be identified and agreed by the parties, which will reduce the life risk from rockfall and or rockroll so that Port Hill's residential red zone is no longer applicable to that area, the costs of giving effect to that agreed solution will be shared equally between them. When the government said that it was no longer prepared to contribute its 100%, then that was their decision not to enter into an agreement with us. And, you know, I do thank you for going to the extent of the trouble that you have, but I think it's time that we stop the area-wide mitigation policy, that we continue to work with individuals who want individual rockfall protection structures policy as per the December 2012 resolution, and hope that in that context we'll be able to help those that want to remain. But, you know, I believe that our hands were tied before we came along to this council table. So, you know, and I do feel for the people who have been so badly affected by, you know, their dreams really being shattered by a series of decisions that were made without reference to them. So, I'll put the resolution. All those in favour say aye. Those opposed say no. And we'll have Yania Hanson's vote recorded. I declare the motion carried. Thank you very much. So the next item on